Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor John Turner. And today's topic is based on his book titled Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. I'll have the link to purchase the book in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, John, thank you very much for joining me today.
Happy to be here with you.
No, thanks. Before we continue, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, this will be the least interesting thing we talk about, but sure. So I teach religious studies and history at George Mason University. My background is in history, so I have a PhD in U.S. history from Notre Dame. And I've been interested in a number of topics within the general intersection of religion and American history, including evangelicals, 17th century Plymouth colony, and then also Mormonism. So I've written a few books on the Latter-day Saints or Mormons, including this biography of Joseph Smith.
So who is Joseph Smith, and what do we know about his background, his upbringing?
Yeah, so Joseph Smith was born in 1805 in Vermont. The simplest thing you could say about his background is that he came from a downwardly mobile family. I mean, his family had a little bit of modest prosperity, and then essentially, lost all of their land and resources just before his birth. And really, for the first 20 or so years of his life, his parents were sort of always trying to restart themselves economically. They moved around a lot. They tried sort of different forms of small entrepreneurship and farming, but essentially they were just really dirt poor. They eventually moved from Vermont to New York. The family was also pretty uncertain and divided in terms of religion. Joseph's mother had some attraction to both the Methodists and the Presbyterians, but until he was a young adult, she didn't belong to a church. His father seemed to be a little bit more skeptical of organized churches. At the same time, both of his parents and some of his other relatives were visionaries who would report having visions of Jesus Christ, other sorts of spiritual visions. So he grew up in a world that was sort of uncertain about, say, church affiliation, but kind of open to all sorts of supernatural experiences.
So what led him to start Mormonism, and can you tell us a bit about his claim that he got a visit from the angel Moroni?
Yeah. So what exactly led him to do that? That's just a huge subject of debate. So maybe we could just start with how most Americans would have heard of Joseph Smith. So in 1830, he published the Book of Mormon, which he said was a translation by the gift and power of God from a series of plates that he had received from an angel. And during his lifetime, he didn't really like to talk in great detail about those events, but he did produce a couple of histories about the angel and the plates. And the way Joseph told the story was he had an initial encounter with, he didn't always use the term angel, a spirit, a personage, an angel, in 1823 when he was 17 years old. And the way he told the story, the angel showed him first in a vision these plates, which contained a record of the gospel given to ancient Americans by Jesus Christ. And Joseph didn't simply go get the plates. He apparently knew where they were in a hillside near his family farm. And he described a series of encounters with both the angel and the plates. Like, for instance, when he first goes to the hillside, he's able to find the plates, but when he tries to take them, he's like thrown back by a supernatural power, and seems like he can't get the plates because he's not spiritually ready. He would want them to get rich instead of for a loftier purpose. And so there's a series of visits to this hillside every September. And then in 1827, he comes back. He goes out at night with his wife, comes back in the morning holding an object, which he describes as spectacles, sort of an interpretive device that's going to allow him to translate what is on the plates. And he says that he's retrieved the plates and he's got them stashed in a hiding place. So as you can get a sense from this, there are a lot of twists and turns in this story. But ultimately, his story is that he's retrieved this set of plates. And then over the next couple of years, in fits and starts, he dictates a translation to a scribe. And then that's the basis for the Book of Mormon as published in 1830.
Did Joseph Smith compose the Book of Mormon, or did others do it before he allegedly discovered it?
Yeah, so there's both there's a faithful and a more skeptical answer to that question. So just for your listeners who might not be familiar with the Book of Mormon, it presents itself as the writings and sort of edited writings of a series of ancient figures spanning almost 1,000 years, from beginning with a family that lived near Jerusalem before its destruction at the hands of the Babylonians, so back in the 6th century BCE. And it narrates the story of that family's flight from Jerusalem, eventual journey to a land of promise, which seems to be the Americas, and then sort of a long, epic story about their descendants. So it purports to be an edited collection of those writings. And the story is actually a little bit more complicated than that. There's some stories within the story and other sets of plates that seem to be part of this collection. So the more skeptical version of that story is this is a product of Joseph Smith's imagination and intelligence that he dictates in the form in which we have it about a year before it's published.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the gold tablets that he claimed to have found, and were these alleged gold tablets actually ever discovered at all?
So great question. So yeah, gold plates. It's sort of it's a strange term, but what Joseph described was thin sheets of metal with essentially hieroglyphics on them, or some kind of characters. And he gave later in life a bit of a physical description of what it looked like in terms of dimensions. um, and bound together on rings with one portion sealed that he himself couldn't access at the time. So in terms of other people who could have seen this, so he doesn't show it to anyone else in an ordinary way. Some of the time, others report that Joseph kept it sort of under a linen cloth, so they could feel it. And a couple of people offered descriptions, along those lines. Some people claim, some of his close associates claim to have seen like a corner of this object. A lot of the time, or during some of the early months of this project, he kept the plates in a box, and he would allow other people to hold and heft the box. So it seemed like he had some kind of heavy object, but he told his family and his, associates, friends, supporters that the angel had instructed him not to show it to anybody else. Obviously, people close to him, especially people who were considering um, lending him financial support for this project, they wanted to see it, and so they would ask. Um, and then what happens is there are two sets of individuals um, who present themselves as witnesses to the plates. One group of 3 men, another group of 8 men. They don't claim that Joseph simply shows them the plates. Um, One of the groups describes, essentially being able to see them in a vision. The other group's description is similar, but they report to actually having um, been able to hold the plates. But in both cases, I don't think I don't really think they're claiming to have seen them in any ordinary way, but rather that God enables them to see this object in a spiritual way.
It sounds kind of convenient. He could have put anything there. It said those are the gold plates.
Well, now that's totally true. And yeah, I mean, I think what I write in the book is the simplest explanation for um, someone who claims to have a secret object and keeps it hidden from others is that the object doesn't exist. And so, I have a pretty naturalistic interpretation of these events. I do think it's probably also fair to say that for those who were close to Joseph, um, the object, I think, very much did become real. So these witnesses to the plates, his close followers, I think for them in the end, they accepted the the reality of them. When you look at accounts of um, the translation process, it also seems as if the plates themselves are sort of immaterial to it. You it's when you hear translation of writing engraven on plates, you'd presume that Joseph Smith would be looking at the plates, I don't know, somehow deciphering what's on them, working on a translation. Doesn't seem that he looked at the object, if there was an object that existed. Instead, it seems that he primarily looked into seer stones, um, and sort of dictated on the basis of what you could either call revelation or creative imagination.
So when you look at this tradition that it's a translation and multiple people were working on it, but the so-called plates were immaterial or seemed to be immaterial in that process. Would it say a different interpretation of it could be that the fact that there were multiple translators could be sort of an an inadvertent admission that the Book of Mormon that we have is the work of multiple individuals?
Possibly. So, I mean, the Book of Mormon itself as a text, it's complex in the sense of, I wouldn't say it's exactly akin to the Bible, which has a much greater complexity of, authorship and discrete texts. But the Book of Mormon, as it presents itself as the work of a number of different authors and editors in different times and places. And I mean, I will also say I'm not really an expert on the Book of Mormon per se. I mean, I've read it a few times, but there are definitely scholars who have spent more time with it, who do feel that its internal complexity could also suggest a complexity of authorship. My own interpretation is that it is a solo authored text by Joseph Smith. A lot of people well, not just at an early point, but down to the present, think that because Joseph Smith had, very little formal education, and perhaps, the people who made this argument also don't have a lot of respect for his intelligence, that they've argued that there's no way that he could have written this text. And honestly, defenders of the Book of Mormon as an ancient record have made similar arguments, like this must be from God because Joseph Smith couldn't have produced it. I tend to think he could have produced it. Looking at his other writings, they don't match the Book of Mormon in terms of their length or complexity. But one of the things you would notice if you read the Book of Mormon for the first time is that it is intensely biblical. So there's just constant incorporation of biblical language and motifs. And the same is true of Joseph Smith's letters, his sermons, his other writing projects. So I personally think it's quite conceivable that Joseph could have dictated this text based on his own knowledge, attainments, and education.
What was Joseph Smith's goal with this text? What theologically motivated him to do all this?
Yeah. So a couple of things. The first thing I'd say is I don't think the only motivation was theological. Um, one of the things that he's doing when he takes up this project is he's trying to find an economically viable direction for his life. He didn't want to repeat his father's sort of lack of success with farming and other small scale pursuits. He needed to do something to sort of break free of his family's downward mobility. And it sounds absolutely crazy, but he does hope that this book is going to sell well and sell enough to not make him rich, but, be something that's economically viable for his family. That, in a way that's a totally insane idea. But there are records that show his concern for book sales with selling the Book of Mormon's copyright internationally. I think he really does have, some genuine hope that the book succeeds economically. But there are, I mean, I think there are also theological goals that maybe take shape as he's working on the project. So one of the messages of the Book of Mormon is that after Jesus Christ appears to people in the Americas, um, his followers there establish what they simply call the Church of Christ. And it puts an end to factionalism and warfare among people. And as you look at Joseph's later accounts of his youth, upbringing, and family life, one of the things that disheartened him was the conflict and discord among the Protestant Christian churches of his day. And so the Book of Mormon um, becomes, among other things, the impetus for Joseph Smith and his followers to organize what they at first also simply called the Church of Christ. And so he understands this as heralding the reestablishment of Christ's one true church after many centuries of apostasy. That's not the only, it's not the only theological idea that emerges out of the Book of Mormon, but ultimately, for Joseph and his followers, that's probably the most immediate practical theological consequence.
What did Joseph Smith think about the land of Joseph or Zion? Like, where do you think that these places were located?
So, great question. So, um, there are references in the Book of Mormon to um, future events in the Americas in which a remnant of Christ's ancient followers in the Americas, who are now cursed, will one day return to the Christian faith of their forefathers. And there's a prophecy about the establishment of a new city of Jerusalem, a new Zion. And after the Book of Mormon's publication, that theme becomes of even greater importance. One of the things that Joseph Smith does is he dictates messages, most typically in the words of Jesus Christ, that his followers understand as revelations. And a series of those revelations in the early 1830s focus on this idea of Zion and New Jerusalem. And he eventually pinpoints its location in Independence, the town of Independence in the county of Jackson, in Jackson County in Missouri. That might sound a little bit random, but one of the things that Joseph Smith did not long after the publication of the Book of Mormon and the organization of his church was he sent a group of missionaries to what at the time was simply called Indian Territory, to the west of Missouri. The mission is really a total failure in terms of evangelizing natives, but it places these missionaries and a few converts in and around Independence in western Missouri. And Joseph himself makes a trip there in the summer of 1831. He dedicates a lot that will be where a temple is to be built, and hundreds of his followers moved there over the next couple of years.
Was Joseph Smith a Freemason?
He became a Freemason in 1842. Um, it's actually a little bit ironic. Um, there's some disagreement about this, but I read the Book of Mormon and some of Joseph's other early texts as sort of rather anti-Masonic. It's just a few. I don't know. Your listeners may or may not be super familiar with the history of Freemasonry in the early United States, but there was a huge anti-Masonic cultural and political movement in the late 1820s, sort of about the time the Book of Mormon is produced. It was in the wake of the murder of William Morgan, who had planned to divulge information about Masonic rites that Masons swore to keep secret. And so the Book of Mormon has this thematic concern about secret societies and the havoc they can wreak within cultures. And some of Joseph's other early texts share that concern. By the early 1840s, in general, that anti-Masonic furor has died down. And by that point in his life, there are a couple of things that attracted Joseph Smith to Masonry. Number one was secrecy, especially because the church had grave challenges from both external persecution and internal dissent. He was very concerned about a need for secrecy and loyalty. And I think that was, that element of Masonry was attractive to him. I think he also had, he had an interest in Masonic rites, the story of Hiram Abiff, also the emphasis on Enoch. So, and other elements of Masonry like handshakes, the pageantry, I think he also liked. So he and his followers established a Masonic lodge in Illinois in the early 1840s, and hundreds of church members became Masons at that time.
What happened at Deepwater?
Yeah. So what I'm referring to there is, especially over the last several years of his life, Joseph, what he's describing there is he essentially feels like he is in deep water. And let me just, back up and talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opposition he encountered sort of in the years after the Book of Mormon's publication and the establishment of his church. So, in a number of different places, Jackson County, Missouri, northeastern Ohio, later on in Illinois, church members formed communities. And one of the things that Joseph Smith taught is that if you became a member of the Church of Christ, you should gather. His followers began referring to themselves as saints, really using a term from the New Testament. And when they gathered in large numbers, wherever that was, they encountered opposition from other Americans because, if you have several hundred Mormons settle in Jackson County, Missouri, they could very quickly become a majority in the county, and they could control its politics and a lot of economic matters as well. So the Mormons are driven out from Jackson County. Joseph Smith's community in northeastern Ohio also collapses. There are actually a series of expulsions from Missouri. And Joseph Smith himself, at one point, is arrested for treason. He spends about 4 months in a really squalid Missouri jail. Then essentially is able to escape to Illinois. And he and his followers purchased land along the banks of the Mississippi River at a place they renamed Nauvoo. And thousands of church members eventually settled there. It's kind of rivals Chicago as the biggest city in Illinois by the time of Joseph Smith's death. So it's kind of a big enterprise. And then over the last several years of his life, Joseph Smith introduced plural marriage or polygamy. That's in many ways, that's probably the most controversial, most remembered, oft discussed feature of his later life. And that's an enormous story. One of the things that it leads to is a tremendous amount of conflict between Joseph and his wife, between Joseph and some of his followers. And so those last couple of years of his life, things are simply spiraling out of control. And he refers to himself as in deep water. He also says that, he sort of just loves, I'm not remembering the exact quote, but he sort of just loves to live amid conflict, danger, risk. Something in his personality, I think. I mean, he always had a lot of audacity and willingness to take risks. I think the Book of Mormon project was part of that. But then, especially the last several years of his life, I think in a way things sort of go off the rails, especially with polygamy. I mean, he pursues it really recklessly. It generates a lot of anxiety and opposition. And it's definitely one of the factors that ultimately leads to his demise.
How did Joseph Smith die? What was the circumstances of his death?
Sure. So he was charged with there were a number of things, number of legal issues that were pressuring him in 1844. Most immediately, there's a newspaper founded or printed by some dissenting members of the church who object to some of his theological teachings, also object to polygamy, also object to some of Joseph Smith's political leadership. And they publish a dissenting newspaper in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith is also Nauvoo's mayor, and under his leadership, the city council orders the destruction of this paper, by which I mean the destruction of their printing press. And so there's a posse that goes to this printing office, takes the printing press out into the street, destroys it. I don't know, maybe burns some remaining copies of this paper. And Joseph is then charged with I'm blanking on the specific charge. It's sort of it's related to this action against the printing press. There are large numbers of people in Hancock County, Illinois, that object to the presence of the Mormons and to Smith's political clout. And there are anti-Mormon mobs that are attacking Mormon homes, driving people out from kind of surrounding areas near Nauvoo. Joseph issues a declaration of martial law to try to really control and secure events in Nauvoo. And that really brings things to a head. There's a real possibility of open warfare between Mormons and these anti-Mormon mobs in Illinois. The governor of Illinois persuades Joseph to surrender and face charges related to the destruction of the printing press. He ends up in a Carthage, Illinois jail, along with his brother, who is facing similar charges. Related to the martial law proclamation, he and his brother Hiram are also charged with treason. While they're in jail, an anti-Mormon mob, and the jail is mostly unguarded. It's there's a lot of threats on his life, but there's not a lot of protection. A mob fights its way into the jail and fatally shoots both Joseph and his brother. And that's June of 1844.
What became of the Book of, let me rephrase that question. What became of Mormonism after Joseph Smith's death? How did they react to it?
Yeah. So, I think the mob and the other opponents of this movement at the time, they pretty much presumed that with Joseph Smith gone, this church, this movement would simply fade away, which ultimately isn't what happened. Church members themselves are a bit divided about what to do in the absence of their prophet. And church members, they're not all of one mind about things such as polygamy. But ultimately, one of Joseph's most loyal associates, Brigham Young, persuades the majority of church members to follow him to the West. They essentially are forced to leave Illinois because of renewed mob activity. So they undertake an exodus to Utah. The church continues to grow under Brigham Young's leadership. There are actually a lot of converts in England and other parts of Europe during those years. There's a lot of ongoing conflict between the church under Brigham Young and his successors and the U.S. government for the remainder of the 19th century over the issues of both polygamy and theocracy. Eventually, the church makes its peace with the American government and becomes, ultimately, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that people are familiar with today.
And for my final question, what do you think was a couple of the main things that made Mormonism popular?
Yeah. So Great question. I mean, first of all, it was really intensely unpopular as far as most Americans were concerned. But I think there are a few things that attracted um, people to Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and his church. One of them was that claim that um, instead of the welter and confusion and chaos of so many different Christian options in the early American Republic, this was the true Church of Jesus Christ. And I think a lot of Americans in particular tend to think of religious freedom as just an unalloyed good. I think for some people, including Joseph Smith and his family, the greater pluralism and religious options of the early 1800s, they were confusing. They were a problem. So I think there were other Americans who felt that way. I think also one of Joseph's theological arguments, which wasn't a bad argument, was that the God of the Bible is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so if God spoke to ancient prophets and revealed texts to one particular people in ancient times, it would make sense if God was not if God wasn't a God who played favorites, that God would do that essentially at all times and places. So why shouldn't Americans of the 1830s be just as privileged as ancient Israelites or first century Christians? They should expect the same miracles, the same prophetic leadership, the same revelations, the same torrent of scripture, you could say. Most Americans, of course, didn't agree with that, and wanted to make a distinction perhaps between past and present. But I think the fact that Joseph Smith so boldly tried to, close that distance, for a certain subset of American Christians, that was really attractive and exciting.
And I'd like to remind everyone that the link to purchase The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, Joseph Smith, will be in the description below in the pinned comment. That being said, thank you very much for joining me today, John Turner.
You are welcome. I had a lot of fun. Great questions.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.